Hello, guys. I am John, and this is my story, The Arrival and the Aroma. I never thought a small, unassuming cafe on a street corner could teach me so much about people, about integrity, and about myself. When I first arrived in the States, I had almost nothing, just one oversized backpack, a few crumpled dollars in my pocket, and a desperate, burning desire to work. Seavers was the first place that gave me a chance. The moment I walked in, I was hit by the scent of freshly ground coffee beans, a rich, earthy smell that promised warmth and energy. The place was a constant whirlwind of motion. I'd watch the baristas, their hands a blur as they pulled espresso shots and steamed milk. There was the constant clatter of dishes, the ringing of the bell at the counter, and the ceaseless flow of people, students with heavy bags, couriers in a rush, and business people practically glued to their phones. And then there was Mr. Stevenson, the owner. He had a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, and a gaze so intense it felt like he was digging his way through the world by sheer force of will. Stevenson was strict. No, strict is too gentle a word. He was exacting, bordering on tyrannical. He knew the precise cost of every espresso shot, the value of every single dollar on an operational report. He often told us that mistakes are not an option and discipline comes before everything. He demanded perfection, which seemed impossible in the morning rush, but he had a counterpart, a much quieter, less obvious force, his wife, Alice. She was the cafe's conscience. She volunteered for local projects and seemed to know every neighbor by name. While Stevenson barked orders, Alice would move through the tables, offering a kind word, a genuine smile. She had a way of speaking to you that made you feel seen, like you mattered beyond your ability to deliver a latte on time. The calculation and the confrontation. It took about a month for the unease to set in. I'd get my paycheck and the numbers just wouldn't add up. It was always small things, a few hours missing here, a calculation error there, a promise to fix it next month that never materialized. It was subtle, but it was consistent. This nagging feeling grew into a cold knot of anxiety. I started keeping a small notebook, meticulously logging my hours and comparing them to my pay stubs. I wasn't just imagining it, I was being systematically underpaid. I tried to talk to Mr. Stevenson about it several times. Each attempt was like running into a brick wall. He waved me off before I could even lay out my records. You don't understand how a business is run, John, he'd say, his voice dripping with condescension. This isn't your concern. The breaking point came one busy afternoon. After another attempt to discuss my pay, Stevenson loudly declared in front of customers that I was working poorly and that he intended to pay me even less. I was humiliated, frozen in place, and that's when Alice, who had just walked in carrying a tray, couldn't stay silent. She set the tray down with a sharp clack. Her voice shook, but her words were fast and decisive. She stood right between us, defending me, defending the simple fact that a person who shows up and works honestly deserves the pay they were promised. Stevenson recoiled as if struck. His eyes turned to steel. The argument died instantly, smothered by the sudden icy tension. The next day, I was told not to come in. I was fired. An unlikely ally. It felt like a physical blow. I knew with absolute certainty that I had done nothing to deserve being fired. I knew I was owed money, but I was learning that spontaneous justice isn't always the path to victory. Those first few days were a blur of anger and desperation. I was back to square one, but with even less money. I frantically sent out resumes, walking into every shop that had a help wanted sign. At night, I'd lie awake, calculating how many days I had left before I'd have to dip into the last of my savings. Then Alice called. I didn't expect to hear from her ever again. She suggested we meet just as friends to talk. We went to another small cafe, a quiet place where a warm guitar tune played in the corner. The conversation started softly, like lighting a candle. She told me she had noticed strange things in the family business for a long time. How sums of money would sometimes disappear, how the books were kept in a way that looked right but felt wrong. I'm not justifying him, she said, her hands wrapped around her cup. And it's hard for me, but I can't just stand by and watch people get hurt. She spoke with the bone deep weariness of someone who had been closing her eyes to the truth for too long. Her words lit a fire in me. Instead of drowning in my own grievance, I decided to act. Gathering the truth, I found a new job working different shifts. And in my spare time, I started gathering information. Alice helped where she could. She knew the details, knew where to look in the reports, and pointed out the small, consistent inconsistencies in the bookkeeping. This wasn't about revenge. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't about destroying Stevenson. It was an attempt to get justice for everyone who had been cheated. I wasn't looking to inflict pain. I was looking for the truth. In this city where everything was still so new and strange, I began to build contacts. I told my story to my former colleagues, Anna, a barista at the cafe next door, Mark, a delivery driver who sometimes helped Stevenson with cleaning, and Sarah, a waitress who had worked at Seavers before me. At first, many of them were skeptical. That's just how the system works, they'd laugh. It's not worth the fight. But when I laid out my spreadsheets, the dates, and the amounts, the jokes stopped. People started remembering. They recalled shifts cut without warning, paychecks that arrived late, and some who had quit in frustration without ever getting their final pay. We formed a small, quiet network. Everyone wrote down what they noticed. Someone brought in old pay stubs. Someone else found old schedules. Alice carefully collected information about internal transactions, flagging potential errors. It was all legal and careful. No forgeries, no hacking, just documents, memories, and a shared willingness to stand up for what was right. The pushback. Stevenson was not used to resistance. When he heard whispers that we were gathering evidence, he didn't attack openly. He went on the defensive. He made grand gestures, beautiful promises, and attempted to buy silence with small concessions. He contacted people he trusted, trying to frame the whole thing as a simple misunderstanding. For many, his reputation, his years in the city, meant a lot. Some people believed him. For me and my small team, it just meant the road would be longer. One night, walking home after a long shift at my new job, I heard someone speaking loudly in the dark. A man stepped out from the shadows of the parking lot. He looked like a private detective from an old movie. He got too close, invading my space, and said words that didn't belong in this quiet neighborhood. It's better for you to stay out of other people's business, kid. It wasn't a physical attack, but the threat was crystal clear. I felt a cold dread rise in my stomach. I realized this wasn't just about documents and paychecks anymore. This was about my safety. I didn't respond with my fists. Instead, I went public. I contacted a local labor rights organization and a journalist from the district newspaper. Together, we organized a meeting, a public hearing where any employee, past or present, could come and tell their story, even anonymously. The news spread quickly. There were articles, online posts, and whispers in offices. People started looking at their own bosses a little differently. At the hearing, held in a half empty room at the local library, Alice stood up. With a tremor in her voice, she told them what she knew. She didn't name names, but her words were sharp enough. Sometimes, she said to the small crowd, we live in a world where it's more convenient to pretend everything is okay, but that doesn't free us from our responsibility to other people. The testimonies that followed were like pieces of a mosaic. Each individual story seemed small, maybe insignificant, but together they formed a clear and damning picture. The journalist published an article with excerpts from the testimonies and a summary of the financial anomalies. People discussed it over coffee, at bus stops, in supermarkets. The pressure on Stevenson began to mount. The cafe's rating plummeted, regulars stopped coming in, and official auditors scheduled an inspection. The reckoning Stevenson responded loudly and theatrically. He filed a slander lawsuit against the newspaper and some of the witnesses, trying to discredit everyone who spoke out. This only added fuel to the fire. Everything was now happening under public scrutiny and within the legal system. For me, it was an ordeal. I was learning that the truth is often heavy and it always comes with a price. But I also saw something changing around me. People were starting to think about justice in a new way. A few months of tension and paperwork flew by. Then the official bodies opened their investigation into his finances and labor practices. This was not a show. This was serious work. Auditors studied his records, interviewed staff, and compared his tax declarations with the actual payroll. Uncomfortable facts emerged. Ledgers that didn't match. Payments made not to employees but to external contractors who all shared the same two mailing addresses. This was no longer just a dispute, it was a potentially serious violation. For me, this was both a victory and a new source of stress. I used to measure my strength by how many cups of coffee I could serve in an hour. Now, I measured it by the words of people who came up to me and said, "Thank you, you helped us." I saw the gratitude in the eyes of those who had been too afraid to speak. I saw Alice, clouded by the stress of the past few months, finally find a sense of peace. Her truth was no longer a lone voice in a locked room. Stevenson, who had always worn a mask of smiling confidence, found himself in a position where words no longer helped. He lost a significant portion of his clientele. He was legally barred from managing the business without oversight and had to answer to the regulatory bodies. He didn't go to jail. This wasn't a story about grand cinematic crimes, but about accounting manipulation and the violation of workers' rights. But for many in the community, it was a lesson. Even what seems untouchable can crumble when people unite. Honest coffee. I never became Stevenson's enemy, not really. I wasn't looking for his humiliation. My goal was clear: secure the back pay we were owed and improve conditions for the people who still worked there. And that goal was achieved, not through revenge, but through truth and law. Alice left the home that held too many lies. She started a new path, first with more volunteer work, then with her own small craft projects. Our bond solidified into a rare and deep friendship. We weren't a romance, we were allies. We both valued that deeply. Meanwhile, something bigger than I expected happened to me. I found a confidence in myself that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I started to think about my own business. I rented a small kiosk near the city theater, bought a second-hand espresso machine, and using my savings and a small loan, I opened a pop-up, Honest John's Coffee. My concept was simple: transparent pay for all employees, flexible schedules, and a coffee blend with a story. Every bag from an honest producer. I hired people who, like me, had lost their jobs and needed stability. I built a team where people knew their work was valued. The pop up wasn't fancy. It had old chairs, warm light from string bulbs, and the smell of cinnamon and freshly ground Arabica. But it was sincere. People came for the coffee, but stayed for the atmosphere, a place where the owner was responsible not just for the profit, but for the people who helped create it. Soon, I had a regular morning community: students, journalists, and even some of Mr. Stevenson's former customers. Many came just to support the idea, to taste the coffee and hear the story of how you can and should fight for justice. One day, my stepbrother approached me. We had been estranged, our relationship strained by old arguments and misunderstandings. He had heard the rumors, the gossip, and had believed I was just a disgruntled employee. But now, with the truth out, with people seeing that I had acted for the sake of what was right, the old prejudices seemed petty. We talked for a long time at a small table, and he apologized for his quick judgment. It was a quiet moment, not a triumph, just a calm acknowledgement that people can change. A different kind of victory. Life wasn't suddenly perfect. I had debts. There were nights I lay awake counting whether I had enough to cover rent and payroll, but I also had support. Alice eventually opened her own small bakery, employing people who had been through hard times. She became an organizer for small programs supporting employees' rights, her story inspiring many. Together, we'd host charity breakfasts, with the portion of the proceeds going to help people facing unfair dismissals. The city noticed life had changed not because someone had exacted cruel punishment on Mr. Stevenson, but because truth and solidarity proved stronger than the attempts to hide them. Stevenson, forced into the spotlight, had to rethink his methods. His influence was diminished, and he was forced to learn what it means to run a business responsibly. For me, this whole ordeal was a lesson. Strength isn't always in your fist, sometimes it's in a piece of paper, in a spreadsheet, and in a voice that isn't afraid to speak the truth. I learned that revenge is a cheap and easy temptation, but justice is hard, meticulous work. A few years have passed. Honest John's Coffee has become a fixture in people's morning routines. Alice's Bakery is a place for family gatherings. The former employees of Seavers found new jobs, returning to the industry with their dignity intact. In the evenings, when the streets are quiet, I sometimes sit by the window of my little cafe and watch people hurry by. I know better now. Every small act of justice isn't an ending, but a new beginning. And if I see injustice somewhere else, I won't walk away. I'll just start gathering the fact again, because a true hero isn't the one who delivers judgment alone, but the one who helps others stand up and live honestly. That's how a story that could have been a tragedy turned into one about courage and integrity. I didn't find a bloody reckoning. I found a quiet victory, the victory of truth. And that's enough to brew more than a few cups of coffee. Thank you for listening to my story. See you again on my channel soon.